A family on a summer hike in Yosemite stumbles into a nightmare, a severed human hand lying in the grass. No body, no explanation, just a mystery that would haunt the park for 40 years. Welcome to Criminal Mind Tales. Join us as we uncover how this hand finally revealed its secrets. Yosemite National Park is the crown jewel of the Sierra Nevada. Granite cliffs rise like fortresses, waterfalls plunge into roaring rivers, and meadows stretch in quiet beauty beneath the sky. Millions of visitors come each year, chasing serenity in its wilderness. But hidden beneath the postcard image, Yosemite has another face, one of danger, disappearance, and death. In the summer of 1983, that darker side revealed itself in Summit Meadow, a high country clearing just off the scenic Glacier Point Road. Wildflowers swayed in the breeze, birds darted through tall grass, and sunlight filtered softly through the pines. It should have been an ordinary family outing, a trail, a picnic, a day of peace. But then a child stopped, pointed, called for their parents. At first, it looked like a branch, bleached gray by the sun, a trick of the meadow. But as the family stepped closer, the shape took form. Fingers curled stiffly, the wrist ending in torn flesh and exposed bone. It wasn't wood. It wasn't a branch. It was a human hand, still attached to part of a forearm. Shock froze the parents. Panic followed. The children were pulled away, but not before the image seared itself into memory, a grotesque fragment of a human being resting in the grass of Yosemite's paradise. In 1983, there were no cell phones. The family had to hike back to report what they'd seen, every step weighed down by dread. When rangers arrived, they confirmed the horror. It was human, and it wasn't fresh. Weather, time, and scavengers had already taken their toll. Law enforcement launched an immediate search. Rangers combed Summit Meadow, sweeping the grass, probing beneath brush, checking nearby creeks. Helicopters circled overhead. If a hand had surfaced, then surely the rest of the body had to be nearby. But nothing else appeared. No torso, no skull, no clothes, no trace of who this person had been. The severed hand became the only clue. In the forensic world of the early 1980s, there were limits. Fingerprint analysis required intact prints. Dental records needed a jaw or skull. And DNA? That was still years away from being a tool in criminal investigations. So the hand was bagged, tagged, and filed as evidence, a lonely fragment in a box with no name and no story. The unanswered questions hung heavy. Who did this hand belong to? Where was the rest of the body? And what terrible event had brought it to rest in Summit Meadow? The family who found it never forgot. Rangers who searched the area spoke it for years. And Yosemite, already a park with a reputation for disappearances, now had a mystery that defied explanation. For decades, the severed hand waited, silent, decaying, but not forgotten, because in time, science would catch up. And when it did, the hand would finally reveal its secret. 5 years passed. The severed hand and forearm discovered in Summit Meadow had faded from headlines. Park rangers and investigators, with no torso, no skull, and no identity, had little more than a grotesque fragment stored in evidence. Yosemite, vast and wild, had returned to its rhythms. Waterfalls thundered in spring. Tourists filled campgrounds. Climbers tested themselves against Half Dome and El Capitan. But the meadow kept its secret. In 1988, a group of hikers ventured into the same high country region, not far from where the hand had been discovered. The area looked as beautiful as ever, tall grass swaying, granite cliffs standing guard in the distance. But on that day, just across the road from Summit Meadow, another chilling discovery shattered the illusion. Resting in the dirt, whether by years of exposure, was a human skull. It was incomplete, the jawbone missing, teeth absent, the bone itself discolored by time and the harsh Sierra Nevada elements. To the untrained eye, it could be mistaken for an animal skull. Yosemite's wilderness is littered with deer, bear, and smaller mammals that die and decompose in the open. But to these hikers, the unmistakable contours of the human cranium left no doubt. News traveled fast. Rangers secured the area. Law enforcement called in forensic specialists. The proximity to Summit Meadow was impossible to ignore. Could this skull belong to the same person as the severed hand? The question carried weight. If it was the same individual, Yosemite might be hiding the scattered remains of a single victim, one who had died or been killed years earlier. If it wasn't, then something far darker was at play. Multiple human remains in the same stretch of meadowland. But linking bone to limb wasn't simple in the late 1980s. There was no DNA analysis readily available to investigators at the time. Instead, they relied on comparison. Size, condition, possible sex estimation from cranial features. Even so, the missing jawbone stripped them of dental records, one of the most reliable identification methods of the era. Without teeth, there was no quick match to a missing person's file. Decomposition had done its work mercilessly. Yosemite is not a forgiving resting place. Harsh winters bury evidence under snowpack, while hot summers bleach bones and allow scavengers to scatter them. By the time the skull was recovered, nearly 5 years after the hand, most of the forensic story had been erased. The skull was logged, photographed, boxed, and then, like the severed hand, it was stored. Another fragment with no name. Still, investigators couldn't shake the suspicion. 2 separate discoveries, 5 years apart, in the same area of Yosemite, the odds of coincidence were low. Quietly, the files were linked. The case notes began to reference a possible single victim. But without an identity, the case went nowhere. No missing person could be confidently tied to the remains. No crime scene was ever located beyond the finds themselves. And so, the mystery settled into cold storage. A severed hand, a partial forearm, and a skull without a jaw. In Yosemite's archives, the woman became known by another name, Yosemite Jane Doe. It was a title both clinical and haunting. Jane Doe was not just a set of remains. She was a person who had lived, laughed, and vanished, only to reappear in fragments across the park. Yet no one knew her story. No one knew her name. As the 1980s closed, Yosemite carried on with its daily flow of visitors. Families posed at Tunnel View. Climbers conquered granite faces. Campers built fires under the stars. Few of them realized that only miles away, in a meadow that looked like paradise, fragments of human life lay unsolved. And for investigators, the trail had run cold. No suspects, no identification, just mystery. The case file, thin as it was, bore its grim evidence. A hand, a skull, both waiting for the future. What no one knew then was that the future would come decades later through the rise of forensic science. And when it did, Yosemite Jane Doe would finally be given back her name. But for now, she remained silent, a ghost in the park. By the late 1980s, the pieces of a puzzle were sitting in evidence boxes, a severed hand and forearm, discovered in 1983, and a skull missing its jawbone found in 1988, both recovered from the same stretch of Yosemite's high country. On paper, it was one of the strangest cases in the park's history. But in practice, it quickly slipped into a void, the limitations of the era's forensics leaving investigators with fragments, questions, and very little else. At the time, law enforcement relied heavily on dental records and fingerprints to identify human remains. A skull with teeth could be compared against dental files. A hand could be fingerprinted and cross-checked with criminal databases. But Yosemite Jane Doe had neither. The skull was toothless, the hand degraded. There were no intact prints, no dental chart to pull from. DNA technology technically existed by the mid-1980s, but it was primitive, expensive, and used sparingly, mostly in high-profile criminal cases or academic labs. The idea that degraded remains in the wilderness could one day be genetically matched to a missing person was science fiction to most investigators at the time. So the case lingered. Files were opened, cataloged, and filed away. Rangers who had combed Summit Meadow in search of a body returned to their duties, logging accidents, bear encounters, and hiker rescues. Detectives who had entertained theories, foul play, dismemberment, animal predation, eventually had to move on to fresher cases. But even as public interest evaporated, the remains weighed heavily on those closest to the investigation. Yosemite was no stranger to death. Drowning victims in the Merced River, climbers falling from sheer granite, hikers vanishing without a trace in the backcountry. Yet this was different. This wasn't simply a life lost to nature. This was a life reduced to fragments, scattered in plain sight, with no explanation. In hushed tones, park staff referred to her simply as a hand in the meadow or the skull across the road. Among officials, she was given a formal but chilling title, Yosemite Jane Doe. There was no name, no age, no family searching the park in anguish, just anonymous bones. The strangeness of it gnawed at investigators. If this was a hiker or a tourist, why had no one reported them missing? If this was a local, how had they ended up in one of the most visible meadows along Glacier Point Road? If this was murder, where was the rest of the body? But without evidence, all they had were questions. By the early 1990s, Yosemite Jane Doe's case had effectively gone cold. It was filed under Unsolved Mysteries of the National Parks, alongside dozens of others where the wilderness had swallowed people whole. Unlike climbers who fell from cliffs or swimmers lost to rapids, her story had no clear beginning and no resolution, just fragments. Still, rangers and detectives refused to close the file entirely. Quietly, it remained open, waiting, because in the back of their minds, they knew science was changing, tools were improving, and one day, maybe, the hand and skull could finally speak. Until then, Yosemite Jane Doe lingered as part of the park's folklore, another reminder that for all its beauty, Yosemite is also a place of vanishing, a wilderness that hides as much as it reveals. And beneath its meadows, beneath its trails, secrets can wait for decades. By the early 1990s, Yosemite Jane Doe's case had all but frozen. Evidence sat in storage. Rangers and detectives moved on. Then, out of nowhere, her name surfaced in connection with one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history, Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas was already notorious, a drifter turned murderer. He had confessed to killing his mother in 1960 and was later convicted of several brutal murders in the 1980s. But what made him infamous was not just his crimes, but his claims. Behind bars in Texas, Lucas began to confess to dozens and hundreds of murders across the United States. He painted himself as a wandering executioner, killing hitchhikers, strangers, and runaways in nearly every state. Law enforcement across the country scrambled to compare his confessions against their cold cases. And in the middle of this frenzy, Lucas mentioned something chilling. He claimed that sometime in the early 1980s, he had picked up a female hitchhiker in Yosemite National Park. According to him, she was young, traveling alone and vulnerable. Lucas described killing her and leaving her body in the park. The details he gave, the rough time frame, the general area, bore disturbing similarities to fragments that had been recovered in Yosemite. The hand, the skull across the road. On paper, it seemed like a possible match. But Henry Lee Lucas was no ordinary suspect. He was a pathological liar, a man who confessed to crimes he could not possibly have committed. He claimed hundreds of victims, far beyond what investigators later determined was physically possible. At times, he was in one state while murders he confessed to were being committed in another. He reveled in the attention, soaking up the spotlight as investigators paraded him as America's most prolific killer. The problem was simple. Sometimes he told the truth. Other times, he fabricated entire stories. And separating fact from fiction was nearly impossible. So when Lucas claimed Yosemite Jane Doe as one of his victims, investigators were caught in a trap. Could this be the missing link? Or just another of his elaborate lies? The confession itself had gaps. He couldn't describe exactly where he left the body. He couldn't recall the woman's name. And in classic Lucas fashion, his story shifted depending on who asked the questions. Still, the possibility lingered. If Henry Lee Lucas was telling the truth, even partially, then Yosemite Jane Doe wasn't just a random tragedy. She was the victim of one of the most feared killers of the 20th century. But if he was lying, then the trail was once again cold, the mystery as impenetrable as the granite cliffs of Yosemite itself. The case teetered on that edge, between truth and fabrication, between breakthrough and dead end. In the shadow of Lucas's confessions, Yosemite Jane Doe's story grew darker, stranger, and infinitely more uncertain. And as the 1990s closed in, one thing became painfully clear. If her identity was ever going to be uncovered, it wouldn't come from the mouth of a serial killer. It would have to come from science. As investigators wrestled with the possibility of Henry Lee Lucas's involvement, another, darker theory emerged, one that pulled Yosemite Jane Doe into the orbit of a man whose name still casts a long shadow in California, Donald Eugene Gibson. Gibson was not a household name like Lucas, but in Merced County, not far from Yosemite's southern edge, he was infamous. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Gibson styled himself as a self-proclaimed prophet. What began as small Bible study groups spiraled into something much more disturbing. He gathered followers, demanded loyalty, and tightened his grip with classic cult tactics: isolation, manipulation, and the promise of salvation only through him. Locals whispered about strange rituals, young women disappearing into his compound, and an undercurrent of fear that surrounded his ministry. By the time authorities began paying serious attention, Gibson's group had already fractured lives and left scars across families in the Central Valley. It was in this context that Yosemite Jane Doe's name surfaced. Some investigators quietly wondered if the unidentified woman might have been one of Gibson's lost followers. Reports from former members described women who vanished after displeasing him, or who were sent away under mysterious circumstances. The geography matched. Merced County lies just hours from Yosemite, and cult leaders often use isolation to control or dispose of their victims. The theory took root. Could Jane Doe have been lured into Yosemite by Gibson or his followers, only to meet a violent end in the remote wilderness? The speculation wasn't far-fetched. History has shown how charismatic cult leaders exploit the vulnerable, particularly women, for power and control, and the timeline aligned with Gibson's peak influence. Around the same period Jane Doe was discovered in Summit Meadow, Gibson's group was splintering under pressure. Some former followers alleged abuse, coercion, and even physical harm behind closed doors. But as with Lucas, the cult connection was circumstantial. There was no hard evidence tying Gibson to Yosemite Jane Doe, no witness placing her inside his group, no record of her disappearance through official channels. It was all whispers, coincidences, and suspicions. And yet, the overlap was unsettling. A severed hand in Yosemite, a cult leader a short drive away with a trail of missing and broken lives. The pieces didn't fit neatly together, but the unease they created was impossible to shake. For those following the case, the narrative fractured. Was Jane Doe a victim of a serial killer's wanderlust? Or had she been consumed by the machinery of a local cult, discarded in the mountains once she was no longer useful? The answer remained hidden in the forest. But the questions grew louder, and the shadow over Yosemite deepened. Because if Jane Doe's fate was tied to Donald Eugene Gibson, then the horror wasn't random. It was deliberate, the calculated act of a man who thrived on control. And if not, then her story was still waiting for science to speak louder than rumor. For all the speculation, serial killer, cult leader, or something else entirely, the heart of the mystery lay in a simple, painful truth. No one knew who she was. Yosemite Jane Doe. That was the name investigators gave her, a placeholder for the life that once existed behind the bones, a name that acknowledged her presence, but also her absence. Experts tried to reconstruct her story from the fragments they had. The severed hand and forearm suggested violent separation, whether by weapon, wildlife, or decomposition was unclear. The skull, found years later across the road, told him she had been a woman, somewhere in her mid-20s to mid-30s. She was neither a child nor elderly, somewhere in the middle of life, old enough to have formed memories, dreams, relationships, but still young enough that her story should have been unfinished. Clothing fragments were gathered, but none pointed to a clear origin. The forest floor had long since swallowed most trace of fabric or personal belongings. No jewelry, no wallet, no shoes, just human remains, stripped of context, weathered by the elements. Investigators leaned on the tools available at the time: dental records, skeletal analysis, and the earliest forms of DNA testing. Dozens of families with missing daughters submitted records, hoping against hope that Yosemite Jane Doe might finally answer their tormenting question: what happened? But the technology of the 1980s, and even the early 1990s, was blunt compared to today. DNA tests were expensive, time-consuming, and often inconclusive. Matches that could be ruled out were crossed off, but no positive identification ever surfaced. Year after year, her file remained active but stagnant. Detectives added handwritten notes, attached letters from desperate parents, and clipped newspaper articles about women who went missing but didn't match her profile. She became a ghost of the evidence locker, reduced to case numbers, pathology reports, and a few chilling photographs. Not a person. Not yet. For rangers in Yosemite. Her memory lingered in the quiet places. Summit Meadow was no longer just a scenic stretch of wildflowers and soft grass. It was a site of discovery that haunted them. The nearby road, where her skull had surfaced, became another reminder that Yosemite's beauty could turn unthinkably grim. But in the end, the mystery hardened into routine. Visitors hiked the trails. Families camped under the stars. Rangers gave talks about wildlife and waterfalls. And in storage, the remains of Yosemite Jane Doe waited, nameless and faceless. A hand, a skull, an unfinished story. And until technology could catch up, that was all she would ever be. For nearly 2 decades, Yosemite Jane Doe's case remained in limbo. She was a nameless figure in a file drawer, her remains sealed away in evidence boxes. Rangers and detectives had grown old while her mystery stayed frozen in time. Then, the field of forensic science itself shifted. In 2018, the world watched in shock as investigators announced they had finally identified the Golden State Killer, one of the most elusive serial predators in American history. The secret weapon wasn't a new confession or a long-lost witness. It was forensic genealogy, the use of DNA databases, not just to match known suspects, but to trace unidentified remains through family connections. It was a revelation. DNA from a crime scene could now be compared against samples voluntarily uploaded to public genealogy platforms. A distant cousin, a great-aunt, even someone sharing just a sliver of genetic overlap could provide the first domino in building a family tree that narrowed down to a name. For cold cases across the country, it was like switching on a light in a long, dark room. Suddenly, mysteries thought unsolvable for decades were being cracked open. And in California, investigators realized they might finally have a chance to give Yosemite Jane Doe her name back. Her case file was reopened. The severed hand, carefully preserved since 1983, was pulled from evidence. Scientists extracted DNA from bone and tissue fragments that had outlasted time. For the first time, her full genetic profile was sequenced. That data was then uploaded into genealogical databases, the same kind used by everyday people searching for their ancestors. Slowly, a web of relatives began to appear. Distant cousins, far-flung branches of family trees spread across the country. None of them knew it, but they were about to provide the missing link in one of Yosemite's most chilling mysteries. Genealogists worked backward, painstakingly tracing lines of descent. Matches to second cousins pointed to a wider family group. Additional links closed the gaps. The branches narrowed, pointing investigators toward a region, a cluster of surnames, and finally, a single possibility. After nearly 40 years, the faceless woman of Summit Meadow was no longer a Jane Doe. She was becoming a daughter, a sister, a human being whose story had been waiting to be reclaimed. And the closer investigators got, the more chilling the question became. Once they knew her name, would it reveal what happened to her, or only deepen the mystery? In 2022, the decades-long silence finally broke. The woman who had haunted Yosemite as Jane Doe was no longer an anonymous figure in the park's shadow. She had a name. She had a life. She had a family who had been waiting for answers. Her name was Patricia Hicks. The genetic genealogy work had done its job. Piece by piece, the web of relatives had narrowed until investigators landed on Patricia's family, a family who had long wondered what had happened to her back in the early 1980s. For them, the call from investigators was both devastating and relieving. After 40 years of uncertainty, they finally knew. Patricia hadn't simply disappeared without trace. She had been there all along, hidden in Yosemite, reduced to fragments. Patricia Hicks had lived in California, in the Central Valley, not far from the very park where her remains were found. She was in her early 30s when she vanished, matching the forensic estimates made years before. But her life story carried its own shadows. According to reports, Patricia had connections in Merced County, the very same region where Donald Eugene Gibson's cult had flourished. Some whispered she had been pulled into that orbit, controlled by the manipulations of a self-proclaimed prophet. Others believed she was simply trying to navigate a difficult life, vulnerable to those who promised community or belonging. Whatever the truth, one fact was certain. By the early 1980s, Patricia Hicks disappeared. For her family, there was no goodbye, no body, no closure. She was gone, and no one could explain why. That's why the discovery in Yosemite, first the severed hand and forearm in 1983, then the skull 5 years later, was so cruelly incomplete. Patricia was reduced to a riddle with no answer, and her family was left to live with absence, replaying the same haunting question for decades. Where did she go? Now, in 2022, they finally had an answer, if only a partial one. The remains in Summit Meadow were Patricia's. The Jane Doe, who had become a ghost of Yosemite's history, was restored to her name. The emotional weight of that revelation was immense. For Patricia's relatives, it was confirmation of what they had feared but never known. For investigators, it was a moment of vindication. The technology had worked. The persistence had paid off. For the public, it was a reminder of how thin the line is between memory and forgetting. Yet even in that breakthrough, a deeper truth lingered. Identifying Patricia Hicks solved only half the puzzle. Yes, she had a name now. Yes, she had been returned to her family in memory. But the most critical question, what happened to her, remained unanswered. Was she the victim of a wandering killer like Henry Lee Lucas? Did she fall into the grip of Donald Eugene Gibson's cult? Or was there some other, still hidden truth that led her into the mountains, never to return alive? 40 years after her hand was found in Summit Meadow, Patricia Hicks was no longer Jane Doe. She was once again a daughter, a woman with a story. But the mystery of her death still clung to the cliffs and forests of Yosemite, unsolved, unsettled, and unbearably haunting. Patricia Hicks finally had her name back. After 40 years of silence, she was no longer just Yosemite Jane Doe. But names don't solve crimes. Names don't explain how or why a life was cut short. And for Patricia, the questions only grew sharper. The official cause of death? Still unknown. Pathologists could not determine whether she had been strangled, stabbed, shot, or beaten. Too much time had passed. Too little of her remained. The location of the rest of her body? Never recovered. Only the hand and forearm in 1983. Only the skull across the road 5 years later. No spine, no ribs, no pelvis, nothing else. Just fragments scattered in the wilderness, separated by time, distance, and mystery. And that led to the most disturbing puzzle of all. Why only those parts? Wildlife could explain some scattering. Animals dragging remains over the years. But decomposition alone didn't account for the absence of nearly an entire skeleton. Had her body been deliberately dismembered? Had pieces been buried, hidden, or destroyed? The theories continued to divide. Henry Lee Lucas, the serial killer who claimed countless victims, some real, many imagined. He placed himself in Yosemite, claimed to have killed a hitchhiker. But Lucas's confessions were so riddled with lies that investigators could never know whether to believe him. Donald Eugene Gibson, the cult leader in Merced County. Patricia's ties to his community were real, raising the possibility she had been under his influence. Could she have been discarded in the mountains as punishment or sacrifice? Or did she simply vanish from his orbit and meet her end some other way? Or perhaps it wasn't either of them. Perhaps it was something else entirely. An unknown predator, an accident concealed by circumstance, or violence no one had ever imagined. The truth is brutal in its simplicity. Even with modern science, no one knows who killed Patricia Hicks. What remains are fragments, a hand, a forearm, a skull, and silence. And in Yosemite, that silence echoes. Families picnic in Summit Meadow. Hikers walk the same trails where a family once stumbled upon horror. Cars pass along the road where a skull emerged years later. Most have no idea of the story buried beneath the beauty. But for those who do know, Patricia Hicks is more than a name in a file. She is a question mark carved into the wilderness itself, a mystery with pieces missing, a crime with no cause, no killer, no closure. And perhaps the most chilling fact of all, even when the forest gives up its secrets, it never gives up all of them. For nearly 40 years, Patricia Hicks was known only as Yosemite Jane Doe, a severed hand, a skull across the road, a nameless figure in a national park that swallows mysteries whole. Now, at least, she is no longer forgotten. She has her name back. She has her story, however fragmented, placed into the record of history. But justice? Justice has yet to be served. Her death remains unsolved. The questions linger in the air like the thin mist that drifts through Summit Meadow in the early morning. Who killed her? Why was only part of her body ever recovered? And what darkness led her into the forest in the first place? The case of Patricia Hicks is more than just a true crime story. It is a reminder of how far science has come and how much further it may still need to go. Forensic genealogy, once unimaginable, gave a name back to a woman who had been stripped of identity for decades. It proved that even in silence, the dead can speak, that even in fragments, there can be truth. Yet Yosemite still holds its secrets. Patricia's mystery is not the first to haunt its trails, and it won't be the last. America's national parks are places of beauty, wonder, and sometimes unspeakable tragedy. For every case solved, there are others still waiting, buried in the soil, hidden among the trees, waiting for technology or luck to reveal them. And so the legacy of Patricia Hicks lingers, suspended between discovery and closure. She is remembered, but not avenged, identified, but not explained. The next time you walk a quiet trail in Yosemite, remember, the forest keeps its secrets. Some for decades, some perhaps forever. What do you think? Was Patricia Hicks the victim of a serial killer, a cult leader's grip, or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments.